Lord Jordan.
I beg leave to ask the question standing in my name on the order paper.
My Lords, we want to build homes that are safe and secure. The building regulations set requirements to ensure the safety of people using buildings. We're developing a programme to review the guidance which supports the building regulations as part of our response to Dame Judith Hackett's recent review of building regulations and fire safety.
I thank the Minister for his reply and declare an interest as Deputy President of ROSPA. Is the Minister aware that almost 40% of accidental injuries treated in hospital and emergency departments result from home accidents? ROSPA estimates that every 5 days there is a fatal fall on the stairs of a newly built home. The National Accident Prevention Strategy advocates the use of the current version of British Standard BS 5395, the voluntary code of practice for the design of stairs. The widespread adoption of this standard would significantly reduce stair-related injuries and fatalities. Given the government's intention to build 300,000 homes a year, will the Minister assure us that all new homes built as part of its programme will be required to adhere to the British safety standard for stairs?
My Lords, could I first of all thank the Noble Lord for all he does and indeed all that ROSPA does with regard to home safety. I am aware of those statistics he refers to. The most prevalent way of people losing their lives at home is indeed falls on the stairs. We have in the next year the opportunity, when we're looking at the guidance on this, to tighten this up, and without prejudice to any discussions. One way would be providing 2 handrails, for example, automatic lighting to come on and stairs. ROSPA will be part of that process. We work very closely with them. On the 20th of December we had a seminar which we attended, which they led on, so I can give, I think, the reassurances that the Noble Lord is seeking.
My Lord, I hear from people who are carers for elderly that falls are fairly regular on these stairs because some of the lifts in the blocks are turned off on the weekend and the people have to be taken, even by ambulance crew, if not by some carer, down the stairs, often many layers of stairs. So I think it's very important that something should be done to ensure that there is a way down and out or up and in, because they return from hospital in the same way. And a lot of those accidents could be avoided if there was some lift facility definitely available for the high-rise. And could I also ask the Minister, is he willing to confirm that where a place is specially adapted for a suitable lack of ability or problem someone has, that if they die or will have to go into full-time care, such a thing would not be changed but offered again to someone with the same great needs?
My Lords, I thank my noble friend on the last point. That's certainly a point of common sense. I think that would be through the Disabilities Facilities Grant, in that if something is required in the way that the noble Lord Jordan was referring to, that would be all new premises. The noble lady raises an interesting point and shows the importance of looking at this in the round about the situation with high-rise blocks. It is the case that people are living longer. Most of the accidents that happen in the home are people aged 65 or above, and it accelerates, as you'd expect, as people get older. So it is a particular concern and something we need to watch like hawks.
It's been reported over the Christmas recess period that large house builders declared dividends of over £2 billion in 2018. Does the Minister agree that this fact sits most uncomfortably with the facts produced by ROSPA? And given low space standards in new homes, too many defects in new homes, and a rising number of accidents, might the government heed the clear advice of the Royal Institute of British Architects, who are calling for building regulations to be strengthened rather than depending in part on the planning system in relation to the regulation of space standards?
My Lords, I should first of all say that the document produced by ROSPA, Homes Safer by Design, is something that they've been working on with Berkeley Homes. So I think it's fair to give them a name check for what they do. But it's correct that the noble lord is right, that there is a responsibility here on builders to adhere to the building regulations. We're looking at the building regulations. As I say, 6,000 deaths a year is clearly something that's unacceptable. I think we can get that figure down, and we're very keen to do so by appropriate guidance and appropriate regulations.
My Lords, I've listened carefully to the noble lord's replies, and then I recall the efforts in this House to improve build quality, energy efficiency, sustainable drainage, electrical safety and other measures, and the noble lord and his parties opposed them all, or has been dragged finally in the right direction in the case of electrical safety. But even there, we still do have the measures in place in the private rented sector, a measure that will save lives and reduce serious injury in the home. Why is that?
My Lords, the noble lord is being uncharacteristically unfair. First of all, if he looks at the record with regard to what we've been doing in, say, no, it's a serious issue on cladding. He will know that we moved to ban combustible cladding very quickly when the evidence was there. On electrical safety, we will be bringing forward regulations in relation to that. I've indicated that within the next year on Hackett, we'll be reviewing all of the documents relating to building safety with a view to ensuring that we minimise and hopefully eliminate, but certainly minimise the number of accidents at home.
She's really a branch of preventative medicine, really. And in this respect to the government review, will they talk with Sir Nicholas Wald, Professor of Preventative Medicine at the Wolfson Institute, where there's lots of good ideas on this area? And whilst they're doing so, by the way, they might well ask him his views about the preventative medicine aspect of fortifying flour with folic acid. Because in 1990, he headed the Medical Research Council of the UK that discovered the link with deficiency in this issue, which had been adopted by 80 other countries as a preventative measure.
My Lords, it's obvious that the noble lord has been going to the same seminars as Lord West with regard to framing questions, but I'm sure that point will have been picked up, my Lords. But with regard to the general point, of course, we're very happy to hear with regard to prevention. It is indeed better than cure. There is a public health budget which is held by the Department of Health, which is the other side of the coin. We've got the building regulations, but you also need the money that is being spent on promotion to make sure that people are aware of these issues.
Noble Lord the Minister aware that many of these standards developed by the BSI are only available on the payment of a fee, which can actually be quite high. And would he agree that it doesn't make a lot of sense to have something which, on occasion, actually has the force of secondary legislation, which is only accessible if you pay for it? Surely, if something is designed for safety, it should be freely accessible for people to look at.
I do agree with the noble lady that the information should be freely accessible. Obviously, there is a cost to deploying this, and you have to get the balance right. But certainly, I do agree with her that it is very important that we have access to the information so that people are aware of what their rights are in this regard.
Lord Beith. I also beg leave to ask the question standing in my name on the order paper.
My Lords, the Government has a full understanding of the time required for the consideration and approval of EU exit-related statutory instruments. We remain confident that all EU exit-related SIs required to ensure a functioning statute book will be brought forward in good time for exit day and with the appropriate scrutiny.
It's not very informative, my Lords. In broad terms, there are at least 200 statutory instruments, new laws in the scrutiny process, at least 300 still to be brought forward, and there will be more arising from either a withdrawal agreement bill or a bill to cope with the consequences of no deal. Does the Minister recognise that even if this House devoted 8 hours every working day up to March the 29th to these new laws, they wouldn't get an hour's consideration each? And can he guarantee that the Government will not resort to emergency powers, enabling it to legislate without prior parliamentary approval? Because if there is an emergency, it's one of the Government's own making. And doesn't he see that this situation is making a mockery of the idea that we're bringing back control of our own laws?
Well, as I said, we remain confident that we will be able to deliver the programme in time. With regard to his question about urgent procedures, we do not expect to have to use the urgent procedure under the EU Withdrawal Act, but of course at this stage we cannot rule anything out, but we have no expectation of being able to do so.
This side. The noble Lord the Minister's attention to a statutory instrument produced by Beith. 636 pages, 2.54 kilos, 11 disparate subjects addressed to this House as one statutory instrument. Talking about procedures, this is unprecedented. Can the noble Lord the Minister assure the House that this is not simply an underhand way of reducing the number of statutory instruments we need to scrutinise and therefore reduce the time delays? Because this document on its own would take days to undergo proper scrutiny in this House.
Well, I thank the noble Lord for drawing that to my attention, but I have more regard for his scrutiny powers than he does himself. I'm sure he will give the matter its full consideration. But these are essential pieces of legislation, and we will need to introduce them before exit day.
My Lords, can my noble friend tell the House what proportion of these statutory instruments contain Henry VIII provisions? And would he agree that if there is any growth in the number of Henry provisions, it creates a dangerous imbalance in powers between the Executive and Parliament and therefore should be resisted?
Well, we are endeavouring to keep the number containing Henry VIII powers to a minimum, but I will write to the noble Lord with the detailed numbers.
The Business Secretary said this morning on the Today programme that no deal would be a disaster. This view is said to be shared by some other Cabinet Ministers. So why does the Government not rule it out and thus withdraw the SIs that address a no-deal scenario and allow more time for consideration of regular ones?
Well, we have said that we do not want or expect a no-deal situation to arise, but it's a responsible thing to do to prepare for it.
Parliamentary authority is there for expenditure, including on SIs, for a no-deal scenario which has now been ruled out by the other place?
Well, the no-deal scenario has not been ruled out by the other place. This House, the other House, Parliament as a whole, have legislated for the fact that we leave the European Union on the 29th of March this year. We will hope to do so with a deal, but if not, we will leave without a deal.
Lords, does the Government have no concerns about the quality of the legislation, primary and secondary, that will need to be enacted by the 29th of March? One understands the political reasons for not seeking an extension of the Article 50 process, but surely the national interest does so require.
Of course we have concerns about the equality. We are endeavouring to keep all of the relevant committees informed of when SIs will be tabled. We wrote to them before Christmas to give them details of that. We are publishing full explanatory statements with every SI as required under the legislation, so we are endeavouring to work with Parliament as much as possible on this process.
My Lords, it's been touched on already, but many of the SIs that are being laid are in preparation of a no-deal Brexit. Does the noble Lord the Minister not agree that a huge amount of parliamentary time, civil servants' time and money would be far better spent and saved if the Government simply did not bring forward SIs that had to deal with a no-deal Brexit? Nobody wants it.
Well, the Labour Party can't have it both ways. They can't, on the one hand, say that we are voting against the best and only deal available, and then saying, but we don't want no deal. You know? No deal is the absence of a deal. If you want a deal, European Union leaders have made it very clear that this is the best and only deal available, result of 2 years of negotiation. There is no alternative deal available. If you don't want no deal, then you need to vote for the deal.
Noble Lord the Minister explained the Government's complete lack of urgency in dealing with statutory instruments. We are today going to rise by about 3 o'clock. We normally rise at 7 o'clock. We're not sitting tomorrow. The Noble Lord Locke Cunningham has very graphically demonstrated that on current plans there is no way that the Government is scheduling business so that we can deal with SIs in a professional manner. Why?
Well, the organisation of business in the House is, of course, a matter for my noble friend, the Chief Whip, and for the usual channels. I'm sure they will, as they always do, work together collaboratively and cooperatively to make sure that there is sufficient time for the proper scrutiny of all the appropriate legislation.
Order.
I've taken a lot of interest in the SI process, and of course most of these SIs are needed whether you have a deal or whether you don't have a deal to bring EU law into UK law. And I think we should support that process, whatever you think, in the bigger debate of today.
Yeah. I thank my noble friend for her constructive comments, because the reality is that we are leaving the European Union. That is the decision that has been made in the referendum, decision made by Parliament. We happen to believe that we should do it with a functioning statute book.
My Lords, I beg leave to ask the question standing in my name on the order paper.
My Lords, we are deeply concerned about restrictions to civil and political freedoms in China, particularly about the treatment of ethnic minorities, freedom of expression, association and assembly, and freedom of religion or belief. We highlighted these concerns publicly during China's Universal Periodic Review in November 2018 and in my subsequent statement. During 2018, the UK raised human rights bilaterally with China on a number of occasions, including by the Prime Minister, the Foreign Secretary, ministers and indeed senior officials.
My Lords, in thanking the noble Lord the Minister for that reply, has he noted that at the very heart of the deterioration of human rights in China has been the imprisonment, the interrogation, in some cases even the torture of some 300 human rights lawyers, activists and their families? Among the issues that these brave lawyers have pursued is the mass repression of Uyghurs in Xinjiang, the destruction of Christian churches, the arrest and detention of pastors like Wang Yi and his wife Jiang Ron just before Christmas, and the forced harvesting of organs from prisoners of conscience, described by Sir Geoffrey Nice, QC's China Tribunal, and I quote, as involving a very substantial number of victims and beyond reasonable doubt perpetrated by the state. My Lords, can the noble Lord the Minister assure us that when the Universal Periodic Review is looked at again, that these questions will be put onto the agenda and that the government will do much more to try and raise levels of support for these courageous lawyers and civil society groups who don't want China to regress into the violence and the destruction that was so characteristic of the Cultural Revolution?
My Lords, first of all, may I commend the efforts of the noble Lord in consistently raising this issue and for standing up for the different communities, the lawyers, the activists, the different people of different faith, and indeed the people who are being subjected to specific targeting when it comes to the issue of organ harvesting. Firstly, let me reassure him, during the last UPR in Geneva, I made it a specific point to raise some of the issues quite directly, including the treatment of lawyers and the treatment of religious minorities, including the closure of Christian churches, and of course the situation, the desperate situation of the Uyghurs. On the issue of the review on organ harvesting being conducted by Sir Geoffrey Nice, he'll note the fact that we ensured that some of my officials attended the preliminary findings of that report, and we are currently awaiting the detailed outcome of that. But let me reassure the noble Lord, indeed all noble Lords, that we will consistently raise this publicly through processes such as the UPR and bilaterally, as I indicated in my original answer.
Lords, I'm extremely grateful for the noble Lord the Minister for his response, and also for Mark Phil's response to my honourable friend's question just before written question just before Christmas. The question I would like to ask, though, is, noting all the contact that we've had through the Foreign Secretary and himself in terms of raising our concerns, has the FCO actually taken the trouble to speak to the Department of Trade and other civil society, including business, about our concerns on civil liberties? Because engagement is not just simply about political representation. We should make clear to everyone engaged with China we have genuine concerns over human rights, and to do business with China we need to see an improvement.
My Lords, the government is clear, and I've repeatedly said as much both bilaterally but also importantly publicly, that we will not seek, just because we are, and of course the trading relationship with China is an important one. China is an important strategic partner, and it's because of our strength of our partnership we're able to raise these issues consistently, bilaterally. He raised an important issue of a cross-government approach. Let me reassure him that is exactly the approach we take, and we will continue to raise these concerns, as I said, through international fora and bilaterally, because the situation for particular minorities, particular groups, we haven't mentioned journalists, for example. The detention of journalists in China is also deeply concerning. Indeed, it's one of the countries which is paramount in our minds as the Foreign Secretary launches his new campaign this year on media freedom.
It's good to know that the government is making these representations, but what evidence is there that the Chinese are listening and acting on the representations being made? It surely is a matter of the profoundest concern that the country that will be the dominant power in the world by the middle of this century indulges in these practices.
My Lords, our job is to raise this concern bilaterally, as I said, and with other like-minded partners, with our Chinese counterparts, and we will continue to do so. If I can quote a recent example, just before Christmas, and I mentioned this in your Lordship's house before as well, we sent specifically our diplomats to undertake an insight into the suffering of the Uyghur community, and they have now reported back, and we're looking at those recommendations and findings very closely to ensure we can take those up with the Chinese. This can't be by the force of hand in any way, but it's through these consistent and collaborative representations that we will, I believe, begin to see a change. And I think from a Chinese perspective, if they wish to see a place in the world for China, which they clearly have, if they wish to see a place in the world for China which is progressive, they need to also subscribe to the international standards and be held accountable.
My Lords,
This side.
This side.
This side.
Just keep going. My Lords, according to the international, there are more executions in China than the rest of the world. Issues that have been identified, not only the death penalty, the one-child policy, legal status of Tibet, freedom of press, lack of legal recognition of human rights, lack of independent judiciary, lack of rule of law, and due process. May I ask the Minister that in our haste of building good relationship with China, particularly in relation to trade, that we are not compromising on these human rights issues?
My Lords, let me reassure the noble Lord, if we were compromising, we wouldn't be raising these issues in quite public fora and with specific points, as we've done so through the UPR process.
Lord Bishop of Gloucester.
Leave to ask the question standing in my name on the order paper. My Lords, this is a government that supports families. Our welfare system supports those who are vulnerable and helps people into work. These reforms are working, with 3.3 million more people in work and 300,000 fewer children in absolute poverty compared with 2010, a record low. Once fully rolled out, universal credit will result in an extra 200,000 people moving into work and empower people to work an extra 113 million hours a year to support their families. I thank the Minister for her answer, and I'm grateful for recent engagement with Faith and other groups on this issue. But the government's own statistics show that child poverty among families with more than 2 children, even when those families have an adult in work, is rising. So one of the principal drivers of this increase is the government's 2-child limit policy, which makes it harder for parents of more than 2 children to work their way out of poverty, contrary to the aims of universal credit. So in light of this evidence, will the government reconsider the 2-child limit? My Lords, I welcome this question from the Right Reverend Prelate because, first of all, I want to say we now spend more in this country than any other developed nation on family benefits. I said I would like to begin by saying that we spend more in this country than any other developed nation on family benefits. My Lords, My Lords, the aim of the two-child policy is an important one. It is to strike the appropriate balance between support for claimants with children and fairness to taxpayers, and families with children who support themselves solely through work. My Lords, parents who support themselves solely through work would not expect to see their wages increase simply because of the addition of a new child to their family. However, I can say that we are looking at the policy with regard to the extension of the policy which is due to take place from next month.
Solution Foundation recently estimated that the 4-year benefit freeze that was implemented in the 2016 Welfare Reform and Work Act will result in 2020 in a net cumulative saving by the Exchequer of £4 billion. Is it not now time to think about redeploying some of those savings in order to provide much-needed assistance to hard-pressed low-income families with children?
Yeah. My Lords, let's quickly look at what we've offered in the budget. The budget has made an enormous difference in terms of the amount of money that we have that we have responded to, we have put into the system following concerns. We announced a £4.5 billion cash boost to universal credit in the budget of 2018, and I have to say that was voted against by the party opposite. But the reality is we are doing a lot to reduce the number of children in workless households because we believe that makes an enormous difference to the possibilities for children, because we know that they're 5 times less likely to be in poverty where both of the parents work. Children need role models, and parents need dignity and a sense of self-worth to believe they can achieve their potential and support their children. The principles of UC entirely support this truth.
My Lords, will the noble lady, the Minister, accept that, on my evidence, shopping at a supermarket in a small town in South Gloucestershire, an area not noted for poverty, at the beginning of the school holidays last July, there was a note on the Trussell Trust Food Bank to the effect that, given that there were 34 children in a relatively prosperous town who were no longer having school dinners, that they wanted more donations because those 34 children were in families that couldn't afford to give them a lunch. Yeah. If I was sitting on that side of the House, I would be ashamed.
Yeah. My Lords, I am not ashamed because there are many and varied reasons why people use food banks, and it is misleading to automatically link this to any single cause, as the the party opposite choose to. My Lords, let me give you an example of the kind of support that we're giving children and families, in addition to free school meals and healthy start volumes. It's not to use up time, it's to actually set out our case. My Lords, a working couple on universal credit with 3 children, for example, aged 4, 6 and 8, could be eligible for childcare support alone of up to £18,000 a year per annum from this government. That is a long way from where we were when, under the last government, nearly 20% of all households were entirely workless. 1/5 of the entire household population of the United Kingdom were entirely workless. That is down to 13.9%. My Lords, we are not complacent, but we're making real progress to support families.
My Lords, I've spent time in food banks, and I've seen working parents go there and bring home food for their children and be embarrassed and ashamed to have to do so. And I really don't think anyone goes through a food bank unless they're desperate. My Lords, the Minister mentioned working parents getting childcare support. Parents of very young children are now required to take jobs when their youngest child is 3, and they can be sanctioned if they don't. Yet the way that universal credit pays out childcare help is the parent has to pay the money up front and then claim it back. A lot of parents just can't afford to do that. How can it be right for parents to be at risk of being sanctioned when they're faced with a choice between taking a job and getting into debt, or not taking it and being sanctioned?
The noble lady will have heard that we are actually doing a lot in terms of cash injection for the support for childcare, but I do accept that we are it is important that we look at the process of how it is paid and when it is paid, and this is something we're doing at the moment. But we know that 30 hours is already making a real difference to families, and the independent evaluations of our early delivery have found that 78% of parents reported greater flexibility in their working life, and nearly a quarter of mothers reported being able to increase their working hours as a result of 30 hours. My Lords, we want women in particular in households to be liberated, to be empowered, just like every noble lady sitting in this House. Indeed, noting the noble Lord West of Spithead, sitting in his place, one of the things I am particularly interested in is supporting flexibility of spousal employment for those women, particularly in the armed forces, supporting their husbands, their partners. We're doing everything we can, working holistically across government, to see that we can achieve more to support both parties to a family, working and supporting their family.
Business of the House.